my voice. We're doing this, baby. Shalom, everyone. My name is Cody Bannert, and today I'm going to be reviewing every single Eluvium album. Eluvium has been one of my personal favorite artists within the realms of ambient and atmospheric music. Over the course of his over 2-decade-long career, he has explored styles like ambient drone, noise, classical and post-rock, all in equally effective ways. And today, in celebration of his latest record, which released in full on May 12th, I will be reviewing every single album in his discography, including his latest one, starting with his 2003 debut, titled Lambent Material. If you're familiar with Eluvium through albums like, say, Copia or If These Trees Could Talk, this album would feel relatively familiar. There's lots of very spacious and yet minimalistic ambient post-rock repetitive passages, very hypnotic, very beautiful and relaxing. But then the main centerpiece of this album is the 15.5-minute epic titled Xerthus Was a Shivering Human Image, where Eluvium technically continues on the repetitive, hypnotic momentum of other songs, but this time explores much more noisy and harsh textures, and is arguably probably the harshest thing that I've ever heard in Eluvium's discography. While I do think this track may drag on for a little bit longer than it maybe should, I would say maybe 3 minutes or so of this thing could have been shaved with little to no value lost, I still do really like how long it goes on for and how much Eluvium almost feels like he is abusing your ears until we get to the closing song titled I Am Much More Me, That You Are Perfectly You, I think is the name, which is a very beautiful, very lush, kind of lullaby-like track, which by contrast to just how harsh and harrowing Xerthus is, feels all the more peaceful and cathartic by contrast. So yeah, a very interesting debut from Eluvium. While I don't necessarily think this is one of my personal favorites in his discography, I still do think it is pretty great, and I would recommend checking it out. Following that, we have 2004's An Accidential Memory in the Case of Death. Depending on who you ask, this one is either an album or an EP, but regardless of what it is, I still am choosing to review it because it does feel to me like it marks a significant point in Eluvium's musical history. For this time, he explores pretty much like modern classical piano music, very much along the lines of Claude Debussy or Eric Satie, which are probably the first artists that would come to anyone's mind when listening to this. This one does kind of still feel pretty much like an Eluvium album when you compare it to his debut. The same kind of wistful, nostalgic nature is still found on here. Something else that is of note is that Eluvium's piano performances are not quite that professional, for he very rarely takes his foot off of the sustain pedal. But it does, arguably to me at least, kind of add to the kind of nostalgic nature of this very brief record. And there are some points where there are actually some mistakes left in, such as on the track The Good Professor, where it almost kind of makes the song feel like it is emotionally breaking or something. But yeah, I do kind of love this album. It has a very warm, beautiful vibe, and thanks to the very lush piano tone, but also thanks to the very interesting, dreamy chord progressions and songwriting that I think would define a good amount of Eluvium's work later on. Next up, we have If These Trees Could Talk, released in 2005. This one is pretty much a return to form when compared to the last one, for this one pretty much continues on where Lambent Material left off. We have lots of very droning, hypnotic, repetitive, ambient post-rock soundscapes, and the songs range from very warm and inviting and pretty, such as on the opening track titled New Animals from the Air, to a little bit more eerie and mysterious, such as I think it's called Cast of the Light Cloud or something. But towards the very end, I think the album gets particularly good when we get to tracks like Taken and One. Taken in particular is a nearly 17-minute cut, which is built on this very repetitive, very simplistic guitar motif that repeats throughout the entirety of the track. But slowly over time, it gets louder and also more harmonically rich, which gives it this kind of triumphant cinematic feel to it, even though there's not really that much happening throughout the entire runtime. I also really love the closing song One, in particular with its very kind of sparkling textures that come in around halfway through and continue on towards the end. Even though the songs can have a greater ability to just kind of fade in the background for me when compared to other Eluvium albums, even so, even when I'm not like actively paying attention to the music on here, it still is making me feel something, and I think something very special, which to me is kind of the power that ambient music can really have. And I think Eluvium very effectively handles that power on this album. And it also kind of marks the first record where I feel like you can really see Eluvium pretty much mature quite a bit as an artist. And that sense of maturity is combined with like a subtle sense of like innocent nostalgia, I think would define his musical personality throughout the rest of his career. Speaking of which, let's talk about 2007's Copia, which, in my opinion, is to date Eluvium's masterpiece. On this record, Eluvium expands on the neoclassical instrumentation of an accidental memory in the case of death, this time with extra layers of string arrangements as well as occasionally brass and horns to create a very lush, moving sound palette. And as you'd expect from Eluvium, there's still plenty of very droning, very expansive pieces on here, including tracks such as the opener Break, which I think does a brilliant job at pretty much setting the tone for what is to come, as well as on, in my opinion, one of Eluvium's best songs ever, titled Repose in Blue, which is the closing song, which honestly never fails to make me feel deeply emotional every single time I listen to it. That chord progression is just so mournful, it's so longing, and when we get to around the halfway point of this piece, there is this very interesting sound. I don't know what exactly it is. It could be either like fireworks or cannonballs firing or something, layered on top of this very melancholic orchestral soundscape. And somehow it gives the song an even more haunting effect than it would have without it. I don't know how to explain it. And that's really what defines this whole album. It is just a collection of beautifully paced, beautifully written, and surprisingly versatile pieces of ambient and neoclassical music that I think really shows the emotional power that these styles of music can have. And honestly, I would consider it to be not only Eluvium's best work to date, but I would say one of my favorite ambient albums of all time. Yeah, it is. I love it. One of the very few albums I would probably give a 10 out of 10 to. It is really something special. Following up Eluvium's absolute masterpiece, we have Similes, which was released in 2010. This one is a somewhat more divisive record in Eluvium's discography. For this time, he, for a good chunk of songs, incorporates like vocals and singing and lyrics. I personally really like his singing voice. His very kind of warm tone of voice almost makes me feel like he is singing like a group of lullabies. That is pretty much the vibe that I really get from this. It's romantic, it's relaxing, it's a little bit somber, but still very beautiful. I've heard people complain about Eluvium singing on this album, which I really don't get. I think the singing works very well, and I will say, though, something I will put as a bit of a criticism is on the album's final track, the name of which I'm forgetting at the moment, but that one is an 11.5-minute epic, and I do not think that length is justified. It pretty much starts like a normal song, at least normal for the album standards, with some kind of mournful guitar work and chord progressions and whatnot, combined with Matthew Cooper's singing. And from there, the song does kind of build in layers and sound for a little bit, but around halfway through, it just kind of stops evolving and just repeats the same sounds and theme throughout the rest of its runtime for like the next 5-6 minutes. And that songwriting choice can either be very soothing or downright maddening, depending on how I feel. But honestly, it is a very interesting, kind of questionable choice from him to start a song suggesting that it's going to go somewhere before halfway through it goes, frankly, nowhere. Despite my minor nitpicks, I still do quite love this album, and I still go back to a good amount of songs, especially tracks like Weird Creatures, which I would say is honestly one of my favorite Eluvium songs. Then we have 2013's Nightmare Ending, which was initially intended to be the true follow-up to 2007's Copia. And you can easily see why that is the case when listening to it, for it very much continues on where Copia left off, with these emphasis on very lush, warm, emotive, neoclassical arrangements and soundscapes. This time, instead of it being within the length of about 54, 55 minutes, this album is 83 minutes long and is to date the lengthiest record that Eluvium has ever made. Do I think this length is justified? I don't know. Like, sure, there's a lot of great material and a very good amount of songs to enjoy and love, especially tracks like the opener, Don't Get Any Closer, as well as a song later on titled Covered in Writing, which honestly, like, for the times that I've listened to it, honestly actually brings me to tears, as well as other very beautiful solo piano pieces like Chime and Entendre. And there's even a track titled Metal, which features Mark Smith from Explosions in the Sky. But that being said, there are other tracks that I do think maybe could drag on a bit longer than they need to. In fact, there actually are quite a few of them that I think you could shave around 1 to 2 minutes off, and you wouldn't really get that much value lost, such as tracks like Warm or Sleeper, or the aforementioned Covered in Writing, which I think could do with a little bit of extra trimming and whatnot. But regardless, from beginning to end, this album is still very touching, really varied and beautiful from beginning to end. And I would still recommend, and I would still consider this to be another very strong album in Eluvium's already very strong discography, and one that I would recommend to fans of ambient music. Following that in 2016, we have False Readings On, which I would consider to be probably Eluvium's most experimental and varied work to date. This album kind of feels like almost like a culmination of a lot of what Eluvium has done in the past, along with some extra new spicers. There's some interesting usage of like operatic vocals here and there, which kind of gives things this very eerie and haunting kind of ghostly atmosphere. And even the closing track, titled Posturing Through Metaphysical Collapse, is a 17.5-minute piece, which, starts relatively normal for the album standards, I guess, but around halfway through, the song gets noisier and harsher while still remaining very sad and mournful. Almost like an interesting callback in a way to the noisy textures that were explored on 2003's Lambent Material, resulting in a very fascinating listen, in my opinion. Sure, maybe it is a little long at 1 hour and 6 minutes, but it is still very effective and very beautiful and really varied from beginning to end, and I do kind of love it. In 2019, Eluvium released Pianoworks, which is his first solo piano album since 2004's An Accidental Memory in the Case of Death. And speaking of the aforementioned Accidental Memory, this album also features not just new piano songs, but also re-recorded material from 2004's An Accidental Memory with a more professional performance, along with other re-recorded versions of other songs from other albums, such as Radio Ballet from Copia, or Entendre from Nightmare Ending, etc., etc. Why he decided to re-record those songs, I'm not quite sure. I guess I could kind of see with An Accidental Memory, considering that the performances were not the most professional on there. But anyway, regardless, I'm going to review all of the new material that is featured on this record because it is really, really beautiful. Lots of very simplistic yet subtly complex piano melodies and piano work. He has a really great sense of nuance and classical style piano playing and emphasis when it comes to the way he performs different notes. Sometimes he performs things in a little bit more of a straightforward, most likely metronome based manner. Other times he does things in a more free flowing like manner. And there are a lot of songs, but all of them I think are really, really pretty to listen to. They all sound like they could fit like some kind of like very somber animated film from like Studio Ghibli or I don't know, like Don Bluth or something. This album also came out around the time that I was going through a very difficult experience when losing a family member. So I do have kind of a very emotional connection to this thing. It has this very mournful, nostalgic nature that was very fitting of how I was feeling at the time. And yeah, I love it. I know I'm saying that I'm loving a lot of these albums, but bear with me. I'm an Eluvium fanboy, I guess. And finally, we have the latest record from Eluvium titled Vibration Consensus Reality, or rather, Whirring Marvels In Vibration Consensus Reality. This was actually one of my most anticipated albums of this year since it was first announced. And this album, in my opinion, is yet another home run from in his discography where he continues to push himself just a little bit forward while maintaining his signature Eluvium identity and personality. This one kind of expands a little bit on the ideas and sounds from albums like Copia and Nightmare Ending with an emphasis on neoclassical arrangements, except this time things are composed sometimes like more ambient pieces, but other times like just straight up like classical pieces, kind of like something that you would expect from like Max Richter or even like Tony Banks solo works, like an album like Five, resulting in a really varied and also very concise piece of music. The songs are often quite short, with the exception of the 8-minute title track, which also has its length perfectly justified in my opinion. But for the rest of the time, the songs range from around 2 to 4 minutes. At one point, things do get up to 6 minutes, but still, everything is under a relatively short length that wraps up in a very nice, neat 40-minute package. And within those 40 minutes, the songs do have a lot of variation in terms of timbre and pacing and vibe. The songs range from very slow paced and meditative to a little bit more upbeat and a little bit more fast tempo and fast paced, such as on tracks like the closer, which is probably the most epic sounding thing that Eluvium has ever made, yet I think he does a really tasteful job at making that work. There are other very somber songs like Void Manifest and A Floating World of Demons, the latter of which honestly has made me tear up quite a bit on a couple occasions. Yeah, Eluvium just made another fucking great album. Like, what the fuck else do you want me to say? It's goddamn Eluvium. He's like my favorite, one of my favorite ambient artists out there right now. Probably my favorite of today, if I'm being honest. So yeah, I'm going to continue to fanboy this man, at least at the moment, because he really has yet to miss. And this album is just incredibly beautiful and is probably an album of the year contender for me. Is that biased? It surely fucking is, but I mean it 100%. And so, yeah, those are my thoughts on every Eluvium album, maybe with the exception of Virga 1 and 2, which were not really considered to be Eluvium albums, or like at the very least formal Eluvium albums when they were released. If you guys like this video, please feel free to like and subscribe and comment and all that good stuff. And I'm going to ask you, if you are familiar with Eluvium's discography, what are your favorite Eluvium albums or songs, at least from what you've heard? And with that being said, I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye. Why am I doing metal horns? I'm reviewing Ambient. Anyway, whatever.